right, so hi everybody. I'm Lynn Barry. I'm the head librarian at Belmont Hills Library, and we are super lucky to welcome Kerri Arsenault, who is here to talk about her book, Middletown, which was just published last month. And the director of Lower Merion Library System, David Belanger, just happens to be her cousin, and they both grew up in the same town. And David actually worked in the mill that she writes about. So he is going to lead the discussion tonight. So just again, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, good evening, everybody. I'm David, and I have a couple pictures here to share about our hometown. But we all grew up in a little town called Mexico, Maine, and there it is. It's in the western mountains of Maine, and there's a lot of trees there and some lakes. And Sunday River Ski Area is about the most famous thing that's in the area, and that's still 30 miles away. There's actually two towns. There's a river running through the two towns, Mexico on one side and Rumford on the other, and the Androscoggin River goes through the middle of them. And Mexico is just one of several towns in that area of the state that are named after different countries. And if you go 37 miles from Mexico, you'll find this sign that shows you all of the different places that you can visit within a couple hours drive of that spot. Lizzie, I forgot to mention to everybody, just so that they're aware, we're recording this, right? And it will appear on our YouTube channel. So that's just something for folks to know. This is a picture from back in the day, and shows a little family relationship. And my mother is the young lady farthest to the right. And Kerri's grandmother is one of the two twins in the middle. And we're not sure which one it is. I don't know if our cousin Linda, who's Bridget's daughter, was supposed to be on tonight. I don't know if she's here. She can pipe in and tell us which one it is, but we think it's the twin on the left is Kerri's grandmother. And they really grew up like as sisters. And somebody sent us a little chat message, and they're probably telling us that, twins identical. Someone was asking if it was twins identical. Yes, they're identical twins. So the three of them grew up like sisters. So our family, we've known each other, has been pretty close throughout the years. And then this is the paper mill. I think this is a relatively recent picture. As you can see, it's a rather picturesque area, but the paper mill sort of dominates there along the river, and the smell of the paper mill really dominates the area. I worked there 2 summers, the summer of '79 and the summer of 1981. And Kerri's going to talk a little bit about the economic impact, but I can say in 1981, in that summer, just before my senior year in college, I made $137 shy of $6,000. It was like $5,860 some dollars back in 1981. And that basically paid for a year of college back then. So it was good money and dangerous, and we'll talk more about that when we get further into the discussion. And Kerri's book isn't really the first book about our hometown. There was a book published a few years ago called When We Were the Kennedys, a memoir of Mexico, Maine. And it is written by Monica Wood, who actually has written several very fine novels. But you can get this book in the libraries. We have it. And it's about her family and the loss of their father, who worked in the paper mill back in the 60s, and the assassination of John F. Kennedy in connects those together and talks about it. Another book that goes back to, I think it's 1997, is called Leaving Loch Horn by Dorothy Casey, and it's about our hometown and growing up and such. That's a fictitious work, and the town is portrayed as Loch Horn. And yes, it keeps going. Deadline by Jerry Boyle. It's written, Jerry Boyle is a former reporter for the New York Times who became the editor of the Rumford Falls Times, which is the little weekly newspaper up there. And he wrote this murder mystery about an editor of a little weekly newspaper in Maine that happens to be called Androscoggin in the town in his book, which is the name of the river that actually runs between Rumford and Mexico. But that's a fictitious town. And then Paul Dwelleron is another mystery writer, and he writes about a game warden in Maine who keeps stumbling upon dead bodies and stuff like that. And in this book, which is number 10 or 11 in the series, he talks about this town called Pennacook, which is actually the Native American name for the Rumford area. And it's interesting, his version of it, all of these have the mill as a sort of a central theme. But in this book, the author writes about how the town turned out when the mill closed. So that's sort of interesting. And one that just came out, it's just been published in the United States. It's written by Julie Cohen, who is living in England now and writing there, but this got published in the United States just recently. She's the town dentist daughter, and she wrote this book called The Two Lives of Louis and Louise. And it's actually looking at a person's life. Well, it's sort of hard to explain. It's two stories of Louis and Louise who were basically born to the same parents, and what would have happened when one goes through life male as Louis and one goes through life as Louise, and it's sort of interesting. But almost all of these books, and this fictitious town is called Casablanca. I don't know where that came from. But almost all of these books feature a paragraph that goes like this. He smells Casablanca before he sees it. Rotten cabbage and boiled eggs. It seeps through the closed windows and air conditioning of the car he rented at Portland Airport. The joke is that tourists driving through the town on the way to Morocco Pond, I guess that's probably Rangeley Lake, or the New Hampshire mountains, smell something bad and roll down the windows of their car thinking that one of their passengers has farted, but that only makes it worse. In Casablanca, they call it the smell of money. When Lou was little, he thought that meant that Casablanca Paper Company actually made the paper that money is printed on. When he asked his dad, he said, might as well be. So that gives you a flavor of what everybody writes about. And we're going to hear from Kerri now. Kerri Arsenault is, in addition to being my cousin, is a book critic and book editor at Orion Magazine and a contributing editor at the Literary Hub. She's also a mentor for PEN America's Prison and Justice Writing Program. That sounds fascinating. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that. Her work has appeared in Freeman's, the Boston Globe, Down East, the Paris Review, the New York Review of Books, Airmail, and this is her first book. Kerri got her MFA from the New School and studied in the master program in communication for development at, it's got an umlaut in it, so I'm not going to.
Malmo.
It's just Malmo? Okay.
Malmo.
University in Sweden, and several other things. So, but we want to talk about the book. So, can you give us a little overview? Tell us why you wrote it, what for folks who haven't had a chance to read it yet. So,
yeah, sure. So, Publishers Weekly gave it a great description. They called it an investigative memoir because it really kind of crosses a few genres. But I'd say it's an investigative memoir and a bit of a literary expose about the mill town of Rumford in Mexico, Maine. And but more than that, it's about the rise in America's working class and the devastating effects of the mill's toxic legacy for my family, the environment, and the country, really. Why I wrote it, that's a longer story. I mean, I went looking originally for information about my family's history, genealogy back in 2001, and discovered pretty soon after how that history was intertwined so deeply with the mill and these toxics that I write about. I mean, I started my great-grandfather, my great-grandfather's obituary and death certificate, and I found a lot of information that I never knew about him, you know, just it was like a little clipping. I have it here somewhere, a little clipping. And come to find out though, almost everything in it was wrong or misinformed. And so after, you know, I tried to find all the information or verify it, and I found it was all wrong. And I thought, what else could be wrong? Or what else could I find in my family tree? You know, just wanted to understand why that was wrong. So like I said, pretty soon thereafter, I discovered he had died from cancer, from environmental cancer that he got while working in the bleach room, which it was in his obituary. He worked in the bleach room. So yeah, why I wrote it, that's partly why I just started one place and led down another path, just like a river, right? I followed my curiosity, and I followed where the information led me, and it ended up, the book sort of is the experience of my writing the book in a way. It starts in 2009 and ends in 2019, and it's in present tense. So it's you kind of watching me research this book. Does that make sense? You're still mute.
Just
Yeah.
easier said than done. I always am fascinated by the subtitles in a book, and the subtitle for this book is, reckoning with what remains. Why the word reckoning? I just think that's an interesting choice of words. I hope that was your choice and not the editors who said, you know what you should call this, kind of thing.
It was totally my choice. Actually, the original choice of the book was What Remains, but they were like, that was already taken by something else. And I had that working title for 10 years, What Remains. So I was like, I've got to fit it in the subtitle somehow. But the reckoning is really what I did, I think, was when I figured out what the plot was, which is not very much of a plot at all. So it was really me going back and forth to home, you know, going home, leaving, going home, leaving. So this sort of recursive movement, right? And that every time I went back, it was sort of a reckoning with what was my childhood like, and what was this town like, and how did I see the future of this town? So it was like this constant renegotiation, almost like just being in like a sort of a bad relationship, right? Like that you have to keep renegotiating every time. And I think that's the word reckoning was the only thing that fit. I mean, how do you feel when you go home, right? I mean, you're not probably as home as much as I was. My mother just left there, but she was there. I mean.
Yeah, I usually got home a couple times a year, not so much now that since my mother died, but I usually go home once in the summer, once for Christmas, that was sort of thing, just to get a sense of what's going on, see how things are going. And it was tough, you know, because it's like you have your life there and it's so different away from there.
Right. I mean, everybody does that, right? I mean, and probably everybody in this phone call, like if you come from a place and when you go back to that place, it's not just what it wasn't, it's what you thought it was one thing and maybe it was something else, or it was, you know, we had great childhoods. I should tell everybody that. I think we did. I mean, yeah. I had a lovely childhood. I have absolutely no complaints, but you can still have a lovely childhood and and go back as an older person to have that perspective. And, you know, because still we were being poisoned as we were having that lovely childhood. We didn't know it. It didn't change the childhood, but it does change what we thought we were. It does change for me what I thought was happening. So that's the kind of reckoning, is like how to sort of wrestle that, you know, into an understanding, or like how understanding not just my childhood or where I'm from, but understanding how my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, how they lived through that and how they did that and how they continued to work in the mill as many decades as they did. I mean, all our parents worked for decades there. My father was 45 years. How many years your father?
At least 40. I mean, I didn't mention that my father worked there, my grandfathers worked there, my two of my uncles worked there, my mother worked there, my brother works there now. And, you know, my grandmother may have worked there a bit. I forget. My grandmother had colon cancer. My mother had colon cancer. Both survived that. My father got asbestosis and developed lung cancer. My niece, who's actually with us here today, got ovarian cancer. And sometimes I feel like it's sort of inevitable. Like, you're spinning the wheel, like, what cancer will I get?
Right. It's not if you'll get cancer, it's when or what. Yeah.
So, I saw that you have on your website the stories of the cancer stories. I forget what you call
Cancer
it.
Yearbook.
Cancer Yearbook.
Yeah. I just started that project. Yeah.
And Ernie Easter was on there, or Randy. Was it Ernie or Randy? I forget. Randy. Yeah. I was talking to his sister a couple days ago, and she was saying he got the lung cancer or esophageal cancer, never smoked a day in his life, but he lived in Mexico for growing up and then moved to Jay, which is down the river where there's another paper mill. So.
And about that, I do want to address that smell. For those of you who are not from there, and those of you that are from there, you know that smell well. But it was funny. I was talking to David just a bit ago. I had an interview this morning with the Canadian Broadcasting, and they asked me about the smell, and this is part of the reckoning too. They asked me, you know, how did it change? You know, we used to say, oh, that's money coming out of the smokestacks, and you know, I thought about that now, and you know, now for me that smell is. It was funny that we thought it was, yes, we thought it was money coming out of the smokestacks, and it was, but it just necessarily wasn't our money. In the end, it was like we were helping line the pockets of corporations and industrialists up and down the line. People who never had to live under the shadow of those smokestacks, you know. I mean, so when I drive into town, I you know, after doing all this research and understanding what that smell stands for, not just corporate greed, but you know, it's death and despair, and really, you know, a sort of hollowing out of our town. And I think, I don't know, it's at the same time, I also want to say, yes, people did make lives, you know, they gave us an education. Our parents gave us an education from that same money that was coming out of the smokestacks. But it was really never so great as all that, you know. I mean, they paid for it with their lives, I think.
Yeah, well, that came about just recently with the pandemic. There was a politician who said, I want to make sure I get it somewhat, that a lot of grandparents would be willing to die in order to save the economy for their children. And I found that outrageous, and many people found that outrageous. But then I thought about it. I was reading your book at the time. Luckily, I got an advance copy. Thank you. And got to read it, and I was thinking, well, isn't that sort of what our parents and grandparents did? I mean, maybe not quite so knowingly, but they sacrificed a lot. They sacrificed their health to make a better place for their children and their families overall.
Yeah, that's incredible. When you mentioned that, I had never thought of that, and they really did. I mean, and it's interesting because people, you know, as I was writing this book and I was in grad school, some people had asked me, why didn't they just move, you know, which is always kind of a numb-headed question if you ask me. And I would say, you know, well, they can't. I mean, it looks like they're making a choice a little bit, and sometimes they do. I'm not saying they don't have any agency at all, but, you know, choice, if you're my father and you grew up in this town and you didn't have an education and your father and your grandfather worked there and it offered such a good salary, health benefits, pensions, all of that, what is really the choice? Is it a choice, you know? And I address that in the book too. And it isn't. When you have the choice between something and nothing, it's not really a choice. It's an inevitability, just like the cancer is an inevitability, right? You know, I don't know. I mean, everybody here makes choices daily on, so like, we reckon with like, am I going to order a book from Amazon and like punish a small bookseller, or am I, you know, because of convenience and price, or am I going to, you know, that's a small example, but we are constantly making these sort of negotiations and choices. And sometimes they're not choices, you know. I see all these questions coming in.
Yeah.
We will get to them, I promise.
I like one was what besides bleach was toxic? And that relates to one of the questions I wanted to ask is,
What did you ask?
you have a master's in fine art in writing. How'd you learn all the science and chemistry for all of this and to learn all of those toxins and such?
Yeah. So I spent 10 years writing this book, and I didn't realize it until somebody mentioned it at one of my events that I did. It wasn't just toxics and science, but I had to learn about like how boilers work, and I had to learn about the EPA and all about the regulations and the Maine DEP and like the history of the town, the history of Hugh Chisholm, who built the mill, history of my family. I went to France, I went to Prince Edward Island, I went to like 5 other countries. So it was just like a constant immersion into this whole thing, so I could just learn so much so that I could write it in a way that was like palatable. Instead of writing it like a science book, I should tell people it's a lot more literary than it feels like, a, you know, some kind of nonfiction book. It's literary expose is the best way I can describe it. But it was really just I was buried in paper, which is one of the last chapters, a title of my book. It was, which was ironic because here I am investigating the very thing, paper, and I was buried in it, literally buried in the paper. It was hard. I'm not going to say it wasn't hard, and I feel like I'm not done yet because a lot of the kind of research I had to do was not accessible to me, you know, through academic journals or through scientists or friends or epidemiologists or social scientists or environmental history people. I mean, I just don't have, you know, you go to, sure, I got my grad, my MFA, but that's basically writing. It's not about like how to do a research paper or how to do any of this really.
Or analyzing a chemical chain, you know.
Right. And I mean, fortunately I had been a paralegal, so I felt like I had some good research skills that I honed there. I was a paralegal for 4 years, but
also I have to tell everybody to read your essay that you wrote for Labor Day.
Oh, yes.
Labor Day, was that in the New York Review of Books? Was that it? Your 86 jobs you've had in life?
Yes, that's the other thing that, you know, people are like, oh, you know, what did you do to be a writer? And that's the answer is I had 86 jobs since age 15. And that essay does cover a lot of kind of what we're talking about. It's like, it's kind of the rise of like the experience of the working class. Like I experienced it firsthand, 86 jobs. I mean, yes, I live in a nicer house and I guess I'm not working class because I'm a writer, but I mean, you can still be from a place that you know, you can still be that person from a place. And that's how I identify myself as working class still, because A, because of those 86 jobs, and B, because that's where we grew up and that's where I was formed. You know, the landscape, not only did we like form the landscape with this paper mill, but the landscape formed us equally, I think.
I just wanted to go back to one of the questions that came by. It was talking about immigrants coming to, well, from Latin America, but you know, technically, my grandparents and your great grandparents all came from Prince Edward Island. The family connection goes back to my great-grandmother is your great-great-grandmother.
Right.
Back in, her name was Bridget too, back in Prince Edward Island, and they came to the United States because of the job opportunities, because there wasn't much, there was even less in Canada, French Canada. So
Right.
they came, and we had in Rumford, there were two Catholic churches across, the parking lots were literally across the street from each other. And one was the French church. So, and,
Right.
so the community like that. So there were a lot of immigrants coming down from the north in those days. So in search of a better life. And
There was over, I think it was over a million came from French Canada, came across the border from like 1830 to 19, maybe 10 or something. And if you looked at, some brilliant person that I did an event with looked at the population of the United States at the time, and 1 million people coming into, like, it was pretty astronomical percentage. And those French Canadians and Acadians that came, they were really the backbone of the Industrial Revolution in America, because it was focused in New England, and the textile and the paper mills and all of that. So they were a really important population too, that not a lot of people know about, which surprised me. I mean, of course, it surprised me because, we grew up in this town that was filled with French Canadian people. It was nothing. I thought every town was like this. But
I remember, I don't know how old I was, elementary school, middle school, something like that, learning in school that Spanish was the second most spoken language in the United States. I knew no one who spoke Spanish, but everybody I knew had a meme who barely spoke English, and that they spoke French. And when my parents wanted to tell stories that they didn't want us to hear, they told them in French. So
French or Pig Latin, of course.
Pig, yeah. Your grandmother was good at that.
I should say, I just saw somebody wrote to Reckoning. I just want to go back. Cindy Barry, who grew up in our town, reckoning is the perfect word for what we feel in adult life. We know that we know the truth. I like the way she said that. It's like when we know the truth, that's the reckoning that you do,
Mm-hmm.
But you were going to ask something about, so you said you were going to ask something about bleach. How I did all the research.
Chemistry. And this, one of the questions we had was what more was there than the bleach, and that was really the dioxin. Yeah,
I should explain.
So much other awful stuff.
Yeah, I should explain that. So part of the biggest environmental problem that still persists today is that the bleaching of paper uses chlorinated products. And before 1997, they used to use elemental chlorine, which created a lot of dioxin, which remains the most toxic carcinogen known to humankind. It was used in Agent Orange. It was found in Love Canal, Times Beach, Missouri, all kinds of disasters. And it's so horrific, and it causes so many problems with our bodies. I have a list that's like this big. It's in the book. And it's also bioaccumulative and persistent. So the further up the food chain it goes, the more strong it becomes. So like if you eat a hamburger and then you are a breastfeeding mother, you will like pass that. The hamburger has it, the cow has it, because it's mostly found in the fatty tissue of living things. You would pass that on to your infant. I think the EPA says something like the dioxin load of nursing infants is 77% higher than is recommended. So even though they changed the procedures in 1997, they still create dioxin. It's a lot less, but still very dangerous. And I should tell everybody that my book is not printed on that kind of paper.
I had that as a question. Talk about the paper used in the printing of your book.
I will. It's funny. So I was talking to the Canadian Broadcasting. They're based in Toronto, and I guess the paper maker is based there. So it was really interesting. It's called Resolute Paper. I put it in my contract that we couldn't use paper bleached with chlorine products, and it took them a while to find somebody who made that kind of paper, and they didn't find anybody in the U.S. Because part of the idea is, if you know, or part of my thinking is, you know, this book isn't out to like solve problems. It's more like to reveal them. But the one thing that people can do is, if we create the demand for a different kind of paper, then paper makers will make it. You know, I asked Dean Gilbert that. Dean Gilbert is a paper mill worker right now, works in the mill. And I was like, why don't you make this different kind of paper? And he said that simple. He's like, because nobody wants it. Nobody will buy it. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start with my book. And I'm going to get other publishers to get on board with this. You know, as soon as this book tour calms down, I'm really going to go to a lot of publishers and say, this is something you should really consider doing. So it can make a difference. You know, think about if all publishing and all US government and all schools demanded that kind of paper. That could really change the market demand, I think. I don't know.
Have you gotten any negative feedback from folks back home saying, you know, you really haven't lived in town for 20 years or more, and you're sort of an outsider, and, you know, you're challenging people's way of life?
I mean, I got that when I was writing the book. Certainly, I should tell people I'm not an objective observer in any of this book. I actually started a water activist group when I was there, because Nestle wanted to buy the public water, rights to the public water. And that happened a little bit. There were some people in that group who were like, you know, from here, you know, this, that. And, you know, while I understand, you know, their needs are more acute. They're on the ground. They're there. I'm living here in this, you know, a totally different world. But it was hard for me to back away from that and say, okay, well, they need this, and I'll just let them have that, because I feel, you know, it's really my mother was living there, my family was still living there, and I feel very defensive of the place. I didn't want something like Nestle to come in. It was just like another version of the mill, just kind of more modern and more evil, actually, even in some ways, than the mill. Maybe not as toxic, but eventually, but not directly toxic, but definitely, I don't know. And now after the book was published, I have only heard from a couple of people who are grumpy because they feel like I look at the town negatively, but I don't really think that I do. I think that I've been very empathetic and loving towards the people and the town in this book. It doesn't mean, like I said earlier, you can have a great childhood and you can love the people there, but it still can be poisoning you. The two things can exist simultaneously. So some people just didn't. And then the economic I want to say this one other thing. The economic developer from Rumford, before my book was even out, it was in August, he said, oh, Kerri's book is about the past. And I challenged him to say, well, I would love to have coffee with you, because, you know, dioxin is not in the past, as I just explained. It's in our it's all in our bodies to an alarming degree. And this mill is not in the past. It's sitting right in the middle of the town, you know, slowly sort of dying because of the demand for paper is dying.
Yeah.
So,
I don't think that's one of the things we've talked about, or maybe we have, by that.
yeah.
One of the interesting things is the economics of the mill, where it went from like 4,000 or 3,000 employees, and now I believe it's down to 650.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's being the major basically the only industry in the area. I mean, you've got the paper mill employing, you know, 650 people, a third of a quarter of what it used to, and you know, there's not much else. I mean, I guess the only other major employer in town would be the Walmart.
The hospital.
The hospital.
Yeah. Which is ironic, right? You know, and
so there's an economic collapse happening too.
There's an economic collapse. I would say that, and this is outlined in the book too, is the economic collapse it's probably from the last 50 years. I mean, the working class was gutted by by cultural shifts, economic regulations and laws that favored corporations over people, the deindustrialization of America, sending things to be made overseas, broken promises by leaders, Reagan, oh, everything's going to trickle down. Well, that didn't happen. The demise of unions. I mean, the 2 strikes happened in our town that really kind of wrecked our town in a lot of different ways. There was globalization came and went, I think, like a shooting star in our town. It was, the currency now is information, not paper. And globalization just kind of skirted away, I think. Our mothers went back to work because of inflation, and the income gap widened and widened and widened until we couldn't even see the other side, honestly. And then on top of all that, we were suffering environmental ruin and disease, So the economic collapse of this town is really over the past 4 or 5 decades. And, in that last part, that environmental ruin and disease too, is like it's not what we think of as a disaster, but it's because it's invisible and hard to see and ambiguous, in a different kind of way. It's like, compared to COVID or this pandemic, right? It's this thing that's like over everybody's head that we don't know the future of what it is. That's what some people in our town have been maybe not consciously living, but living under a state of sort of toxic ambiguity. What's causing the cancer in our town? We don't know, and that can really cause that. I have like 7 books I'm looking at right here that talk about sociologically how that can cause PTSD. It can cause non-empirical belief systems like hypervigilancy, all kinds of things. Like they did a sociological study at Love Canal about this very thing and how it affected the people socially. So anyway, yeah, it's and today, one more thing, to show the kid, there's 4 to 5 kids, I think, in town are food insecure. Can you imagine that when we were growing up? That just like breaks my heart. I went to the school and everywhere I looked, I'm like, okay, 4 out of 5 of you don't have enough to eat. It's terrible. And that's something that's really hard to measure. Imagine being hungry and then trying to find a job or trying to find a car to get to your non-existent job, or trying to buy a stove with no money from your non-existent job or whatever to cook your food. I don't know, it goes on and on.
And there's no public transportation or anything like that.
Yeah, right.
Basically, it's very rural. I
think that's the problem with it too. It's like, it's really isolated. We are very isolated there. Yeah.
Now, you talked about how the town went from being in the prior elections to being overwhelmingly voting for President Obama to pivoting to President Trump. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought you had, you said that, and I'm looking at the time here, we don't have to, we could go on for an hour possibly about that, but when I was reading it, I thought, oh, I understand it now.
Yeah, well, it's good because it sort of leads from what I was just saying about this sort of collapse, this economic collapse, and all these things happening over the past 50 years. People were feeling pretty hopeless, and all that collapse and that political finagling and the corporations getting more rights than people and the unions and all that, it manifested in the working class not trusting the government, really. And subsequently, and unfortunately, Mexico went from the biggest Obama supporter in the state to the biggest Trump supporters in the state. They voted for him in the last election. He tapped into that mistrust, and he also and they just wanted hope. I say this in the book. They saw him as something hopeful, and I understood that at the time. Like, they voted for Obama and they were like, okay, nothing changed. Let's vote for Trump. Let's see if just something changes, anything. They were just like throwing it to the wind, And I think, I don't know, he also did something in that election that I think that progressive liberals and Hillary Clinton did not do, is he like looked at them and saw them. He saw them. He like, he opened his door and said hello, right? whereas the Democrats sort of didn't. They sort of stayed in their liberal like bubbles and really didn't go. And I'm not saying that Trump like did anything to help them or didn't lie, but he did see them and he did talk to them directly. And when you're under that much pressure in your life, like all the things I just talked about, for somebody to just look at you and say, I'm going to help you, that's huge, you know, that's huge. And moreover, to be a mill worker, compare it to being like a lobsterman or a fireman. It's a really big part of their identity. You know, you lose your job, you lose your identity, I think. Speaking of jobs, I do, before I don't want to forget, because I want David to talk about, I never worked in the mill. I tried, but the summer I was going to get in, we went on strike. And then I just never looked back. But David worked in the mill, and I visited while I was writing this book, and I was only there for maybe 2 hours, and I barely could take it for 2 hours. So I'm curious if you could just explain a little bit what that was like.
Well, again, this was, you know, 40 years ago, almost 40 years, well, actually more than 40 years ago, the first summer I worked there. Actually, the summer of 1980, I didn't get to work there because they were getting ready to go on strike. And they didn't call in their summer workers. But once you got in there, and it was a lot of, you know, did your parents work there, meaning primarily your father. And, you know, you had that and to get in. And there's a lot of big machinery in there, and it's sort of scary. It's loud. You pretty much have to wear earplugs all the time. They dry the paper that comes off the machine with steam. So it's like stinking hot, even in Maine, which is much cooler than here in Pennsylvania. And there's things that could grab your shirt or your arm.
God.
Yeah, and then other things that, like, the waste paper goes down into big vats through the floor that churn it up. And I have an overactive imagination. I just said, what would happen if you fell in there? And there were, so that's when I was working on one of the paper machines. There was another period. Of course, when you're the summer help, you just go and do whatever they did. I think the thing I probably hated the most, and not realizing that it was probably toxic at the time, I just didn't like it, is in the back of the machines, you would have to take these 40 or 50 pound bags of white stuff. I don't know, there were different types of them. And it would be, okay, every hour you dump 2 bags of this stuff and 1 bag of this stuff. You cut it open and dump it in the back where the pulp is mixing into the paper. And then you go wait for 3 hours. And usually the plant works 24 hours a day, and they stick the summer help on night shift. So it's like 3 in the morning, and you're trying, and you don't have anything to do until 3 hours later.
Oh my God, that's torture.
It was torturous. I would much rather be busy.
Wow.
And then I remember one of the other places I worked was in the rewinder room, which is where they take these huge rolls of paper that are about 20 feet wide and is taller than I am. And they cut them down into smaller rolls of paper. And I had jobs working on a couple of those different machines. They also have machines that polish the paper. One thing we didn't talk about is how proud people were of the product. I'm digressing.
That's all right. We can take
that paper was used by National Geographic. And when I was working there, it was Geo Bond 60 or something like that. It was the special paper. And there was a lot of pride in that.
Yeah.
We knew that paper was going to end up in high-class magazines. Hearst Publications magazines used it. So anyway, I worked on the machine that polished the coated paper that was doing some of that. And the other rewinder thing was they had these huge rooms where you had these smaller rolls of paper that weighed, you know, half a ton or 3/4 of a ton, and you had to like have a hoist from above come down, and you'd have to sort them in these huge piles and make sure they didn't fall. And you know, that's I'm a klutz, and every day I
I was
fear
just
that.
going to say, I think you were. But, you know, it's funny.
But I have to say, the only thing that really bad happened is outrageous numbers of paper cuts, because you're handling the paper, you have to test, you know, tear it
Wow.
up and
Yeah.
send it to the lab, and it's like every day it's like the hands would come back as
Wow. Like,
full of cuts.
that's interesting, you know, so add to all the other things I was saying about the sort of economic conditions and the environmental conditions, then you just have to go into the mill and you have to worry about like falling into a vat of like, you know, scissors basically or whatever. Just like, you know, that kind of like sort of horror. It's interesting. I meant to say that you mentioned there's a bunch of crime writers, mystery writers, you know, and somebody from the Maine Writers Publishers Association too had commented on my book. I read it in his blog today, but he was like, the story I wrote was like more horrific than anything Stephen King had ever written. And it was interesting that you had mentioned some of these other books were mysteries and horrors, you know? I mean,
Murder mysteries, yeah.
because you think about those machines are just churning and ready to like rip your arm off, or like kill you from something like lung cancer, which our fathers basically died. Somebody asked that. Our fathers basically died of the same thing. They both had asbestosis and then developed lung cancer after. And then somebody else I wanted to pull in, somebody made the connection from Latin America to the French Canadians. And I think that's absolutely accurate. You know, they're coming via sort of foot, you know, into our country. And it's not the same as other populations that immigrated here, I think. It's very similar. And then back to what you were saying about National Geographic, I also think it's very ironic that we also made paper for Sears catalog, which was like the American dream. I mean, do you remember Christmas? You get the catalog, you just circle everything you want. It was like the American dream. We're making the American dream, but like at the same time, we're like killing that American dream by like every piece of paper we make, or killing our own dream, you know, in a way, or our, I don't know. It's a complicated. I'm just looking at so many comments and questions and things I want to make sure we hit.
I just have one thing, sort of a side note,
Oh,
or a footnote to be more specific, is that I liked the footnotes in this book. I mean, when's the last time some writer had somebody say that they were more than just, you know, you know, some report on page 27. There were like comments, and there was more interesting facts in there and sort of little anecdotes. Was that intentional?
yeah, and I actually wanted to do them even, I almost wanted to do an entire book of footnotes. Like I ran out of time, obviously, but yeah, there was so much that, you know, I didn't want the story to get bogged down with, you know, really detailed scientific stuff. People would just buzz right through it, you know. But yeah, I found that stuff really fascinating. I wish I could have written more. And in fact, probably some of the next things I'm going to write are going to be sort of taken and expanded from some of those footnotes. Looks like Kerri Arsenault, Kelly Fitzrandolph, who's my sister, says, working in the mill was great experience. Go Kelly.
A great experience for what? I mean, like, although I have to say that summer I worked in '81 where I made nearly $6,000. I went and did my senior internship and then was offered a job. And basically this professional job, which required a bachelor's degree, and, you know, I had 4 months experience actually working there as an intern. I made half the money I was making at the paper mill. Summer before. So
I'm probably making less. If I had worked at that mill, I'm sure I'm making less now as a writer. I'm positive. All my degrees and all my experience, my 86 jobs, I'm making less now than I would if I had stayed there. So you can see why it's kind of not really, you know, that it's not a choice a little bit. So I never addressed that person who asked what besides bleach was toxic. Mercury is a good one, you know, that benzene, those kind of things cause a lot of terrible diseases. And, you know, from 1901 when the mill opened to, well, till today, there's still just in 2018, over 2 million pounds of toxics were released. from our paper mill. That's just one mill, one town, and that's all regulated, you know. So really what I mean, a lot of what I came to the conclusion is it's not like the mill is the big bad guy here, but it's the regulations that are allowed to, environmental regulations that allow millions of pounds of toxics to be released. And, you know, it's that let's examine laws that favor companies' bottom line instead of their life, our lives, you know, really. Like, who's making those laws, and why is it allowable to have, you can absorb this many, you can eat one fish from the river, right? They always said, like, you couldn't pay me enough to eat a fish from that river.
Although it's a lot better than it was. I mean, they've made some improvement, and I know there's still stuff that's never going to go away.
It looks better.
It looks better. And it's interesting, the folks who haven't read the book, also from Rumford was Ed Muskey, who a lot of people won't remember, but he was the senator from Maine, and he was one of the main authors of the Clean Water Act of, what, 1967?
Yeah, it started, but it was kind of formalized in 72, Clean Air and Clean Water. Yeah.
And he ran for president too, but he's from the Rumford area, and that impacted him, seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole other thing that I examine in the book about him is, you know, it's funny how I say we, and I'm talking about the town, is, you know, everybody's lauds Hugh Chisholm and Paul Bunyan, that big statue, but like really Muskey was the real hero of the entire United States. You know, there's like a small squat granite memorial of him. It looks like a grave, basically a gravestone. Whereas, you know, Hugh Chisholm has like a bust in Town Hall. Like, why isn't there a bust of Muskey in Town Hall? He was like, did an incredible thing for our entire country. There's my family piping in. There's my brother Joel worked in the mill. I worked for a subcontractor, which means you did all the terrible work that the mill workers didn't do. My mother worked as a secretary, gave mill tours. She learned a lot about the mill then. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they used to give mill tours, and when I went in, I was given like the abbreviated like 2-hour tour.
And we also used to get reams of paper. So we always had paper.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm like 4 reams of paper or something like that. I remember friends whose fathers didn't work in the mill. They were always writing on the back of paper, and I was thinking, why you do that? You know, there's paper everywhere. But not everybody had that.
Does anybody have any question?
I have one more question for
you.
You
do.
What are you writing next?
Oh, I can't tell. I can tell you one thing I'm writing. There's one that's going to be this a nonfiction book, and it's related to the environment. But I just thought of it over the weekend when we were in Maine, actually, and I had time with my thoughts and time because it's been so busy for the past literal 10 years. It's going to be about the environment, and written in a very similar style, very not objective, but subjective, and mixing genres a little bit. I'll say that. And the other thing I really want to do is I've read so many biographies as a book critic, and so many of them are written about famous people. And it's not necessarily that people are interesting, it's just that they're famous, right? And I'm like, why can't I write a biography of an ordinary person, an ordinary woman? And then I thought, maybe I'll just make it fiction. So I'm going to write the biography of an ordinary woman as a novel.
And Ann Arbor just is on here, and she worked in the mill too. Her dad worked in the mill, and she spent 7 years writing a novel, and it's 700 pages. Wow!
And you need to edit that.
Not 2 books. Good for you.
Wow.
We'll do another Zoom presentation when it's published. How are sales going, by the way?
I haven't looked.
Yeah.
I don't want to know, but I can say this. I can say we went into our second printing really early. All the reviews have been great. And I have had, what, 40 events now since releasing the book. And what else? I sold 30 books at one event. Imagine that. So that was good. I don't know. I think sales, it's a really terrible time to publish a book. I mean, I was pretty despondent when, the pandemic came down, and I was like, I'm going to publish my book in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of the election, where there's like every other day somebody writes a political memoir that makes the bestseller list. So it's not going to be a bestseller because the political memoirs are selling in the millions, right? Like normally it would take a bestseller, you could sell 5,000 books and you could make a bestseller list. Maybe I could have done that in a normal conditions, but now it's different. So I'm happy about what the book is doing and the people it's reaching, which goes everywhere from, there's a student writing his PhD at Cambridge University who's using my book and a couple other books, to all the way down to like every single person in Rumford, Maine reading the book. So it's hitting a lot of people, and that was really my hope for it, is to do that.
Well, I'll say for folks that are in the Lower Merion area, the book is available at Main Point Books, Children's Book World in Haverford, and the Narberth Bookshop. And Carolyn was saying, so they have a sign that shows how many days since the last injury. I believe they do. I certainly, when I worked there, they did. And actually, not that many people got hurt like that. Although your grandfather had 2 partial fingers.
Yes.
I don't know if that happened in the mill or not. Your mother.
Well, I thought it did, but my mother said it did not. So I swore it did, but she would know better. So they did have those signs. I should address this a little bit. They now have a memorial for people who were killed on the job at the mill, but it doesn't reflect all the people that died of cancer or anything like that, which is why I started this sort of cancer yearbook on my website, which was part of another grant project that I did that's coming out soon from the Architectural League of New York. They picked 10 teams across the US to write about mid-sized communities and sort of the dehiscence of the working class of America. And so we've got some interesting things coming out there. Building a boat is how he lost his fingers. That's what I think I ended up putting that in the book. Yes.
Okay. All right. Now I was going to ask another question, but I got sidetracked here. Other questions folks have, even if you want to ask live, you can unmute yourself and.
Or if you want to say something.
Yeah, or if you want.
I just want to say hi, and I'm loving every single morsel that's coming, and I have your book sitting on my table and I can't wait to read it, and there are just so many insane resonances, and you just picked up the phone and talked to me when I needed you to, and thank you. And I feel like we know a lot about each other, maybe because of these resonances. So I hope we can connect more, and it's been great to hear it.
Thank you. Are you a writer too?
I am. We spoke on the phone. I'm in one of the binders.
Oh, right. That was you. Right. Oh my God.
And I grew up in a mining town and am writing a memoir that is an investigative journalism project that is telling the story as we go. And there's so many parallels. So.
Oh, I'm so happy. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't wait to.
Scott Conti here. I actually wrote the comment about the the signs at mills and foundries. I've been in a lot of foundries, particularly metal foundries with molten metal, where a lot of you go in and it's like 100 days without an injury or a death, and it's rather scary to think about because a lot of these industrial mills are rather dangerous. But on the note that you mentioned about the paper, not having a very difficult time finding the paper for your book that you wanted, it's kind of interesting because I think in the United States here it seems like not certainly not in the mainstream, but there are a lot of people buying more paper products like paper towels and other kind of paper for general home use that is non-chlorine bleach.
Right.
And I just wonder why the paper industry, sometimes it's about the quality of the product for a book or a publication. And is that the reason? Or is it that, again, nobody's pushing them to do it? Because I mean, we have paper mills right here in Pennsylvania too. And you drive through out near Lancaster and York, there's one I used to go through all the time through the town. And it's that exact smell, rotten eggs, anything else. But I guess that's my question. Why?
Yeah,
why isn't it happening?
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. It's both of those things. Nobody's demanding it, and it's wait. What was the other thing you said? It was brilliant. You said certainly nobody's demanding it. It's expensive to change their systems, and if nobody's demanding it, they're not. And if also goes to the regulations. If nobody's regulating it to be done that way, then people just pick low-hanging fruit. You know, they do what the least amount that they have to do, and they're just looking at their bottom line. I mean, as much as we'd like to believe businesses are more environmentally friendly, I fear they're not really. I mean,
well, the other problem is in the United States, we've had a lot of paper mills close, and it's because they often were in areas right in Philadelphia area where paper mills closed because of the environmental pollution. And they just moved to other places, other states or other countries where they could pollute. And that's all well and good, but that's the jobs that are going away too. So, I mean,
I talked to a paper consultant and he said, it's basically the kind of the industrialization of America it was a colonial operation. And now that we have all these laws and like OSHA and regulations and the EPA, they're just moving the colonialism offshore. And also like places in South America, you can grow a eucalyptus tree in 5 years to maturity, whereas in Maine, it takes 50 to 60 years. So there's no, it's just a lot cheaper to do overseas.
Well, I think the difference is that the profit can be made at the top still.
Right.
The people at the top are still making the big money, but the people in the little town where it closes down, they just lost their jobs. And that's the sad part about it. If we switched environmentally to the environmentally sound products, the jobs might stay.
The jobs might stay and the people will be healthy. It's a win-win. I don't get it. So that's my mission with this book. When the next year after I stop this book tour is to get more people to try to demand that paper.
Good job.
Thanks. Anybody else out there? Thank you. Bring the toxic jobs back. No, how about dioxin-free paper? That's what we're saying, dioxin-free paper.
Yeah. When you buy your coffee filters, make sure they're the brown ones, the unbleached ones.
Yeah, it's
like
really
that.
hard. It's hard to find. So.
Yeah. Anything else?
I had a quick question about, you said the people who were actually working in the mill were the ones who actually got diseases further down the line. What about the management? Where were they living? The people who were getting the, benefit from the bottom line or the profits. Were they not living in the same town?
No, the owners of the mill did not live in the town. I mean, the middle management certainly did live or nearby. And it wasn't just the people in the mill, it was the community too. I mean, the mill is right in the middle of, you saw that picture, the mill is right there in the middle of town, right in between two towns. But yeah, it was mostly remote management and remote ownership, and they never had to live under those smokestacks. Just since 1901, it's always been that way. And I should say our mill went from like an owner to his son, then it was like a chemical company, then it was like a corporation, and then it was a conglomerate, and now it's owned by a Chinese company. So it's like the actual arc of like industrial America right there in our mill. It's the microcosm.
And the original owner and the developer of the mill actually helped develop the town. There's an amazing housing development that's on the National Register of Historic Landmarks. It's falling apart, but it's designed to mimic Scottish architecture. and it's amazing when it was in good shape. And he also built the Mechanics Institute.
He built the roads, the churches, the
Yeah,
parks. He did everything. He banked, like
yeah,
infrastructure. He built everything. It was his little monopoly game, you know.
yeah. And did a fairly good job. It was interesting. I did read your friend's book, The Distinct Alien Race, about
Oh,
the
right.
Canadians in New England, and it was better, you know, at that period. The conditions in Rumford were better than a lot of places like Lowell,
Right.
Massachusetts, and
For sure.
those other big uh, industrial places where they did fabrics and such.
Yeah. It was better conditions. But what it did was, I think it developed a dependency on the outside leadership, which I was just talking about. You know, the leadership in Rumford and Mexico has always been lacking. And I think they just depended on that remote management for too long. There's been studies about it. I'm not the only one that says it. There was like somebody wrote a dissertation about it. So I'm not just talking, I'm not just making stuff up.
Okay. I'm looking at some of the comments here. Dioxin-free paper, pandemic, opportunity to rebuild better. Let's hope we'll be rebuilding better. Although I did hear that there actually there was a big COVID outbreak in the mill.
Yeah, there was. I don't know. They might even have to close the mill. I don't know what that's going to do. But I mean, I think that the opportunity, this pandemic, whatever, the biggest opportunity we have right now is November, is to vote for leaders who will, I don't care what party you're from, but leaders who will like want you to live, and will make regulations that are sustainable and livable for humans, you know, so people don't have to live like this. And don't think it's not happening to you if you live in a nice house like me, you know, in Litchfield County, Connecticut, because this pollution is not provincial. It doesn't stay where we put it. So
we live in Ambler, Pennsylvania, and we have a little bit of that here because we had asbestos production.
oh, wow.
And we had what was called the White Mountains, and it was a bit of a feudal society, and the Italians came over to create the town and build the stone work, and
Wow.
and people died of mesothelioma and asbestosis, and still are. And so it's similar, maybe not on the same scale, and we don't have this. Well, we do have this.
No, it's very similar. I mean, there's towns like this all across the United States where it's, you know, whether there's some environmental issues where, and it's usually people that are more disenfranchised or working class. It's not happening in town. You know, it's all over. It's not just the United States. It's all over the world. It's always happening in towns that are just less.
Well, much like your original founder of your mill there, the same thing happened here in Ambler. The original owners, they were beneficent in a way. I mean, they had
Right. Yeah.
they had the town, they had the store in their company for people to buy their products and their goods. They had healthcare. They had everything for them.
The beautiful Gothic church.
They had gorgeous architecture and housing. They built houses from the lowliest worker in twin homes or up through the nice houses for the executives. They probably didn't know originally, right off the bat, that asbestos was a bad problem, although there was some indication. But I think that what happens is, unfortunately, you can be rather magnanimous in ways that are good initially, but once you know what's going on, that's when.
And I should say that the research I did, the government, the EPA was complicit with the paper industry. They were found to be in collusion and hiding facts of dioxin from the public. And they're currently still shelved a report that talks about the cancer rates, in the cancer problems from dioxin. That report has not been published for very, very good reason. So this is not in the past like people think it is. And you know, the dioxin scare was in the 80s and 90s, but the only reason it's not a scare now is because they really just buried it deep so that people aren't thinking about it. And that's probably with a lot of things, you know. I mean, it was asbestos for a while, and now that's obviously a problem. But and I don't want to keep people too long. David, there was one question about the breastfeeding and the dioxin is frightening. Yeah, it is frightening. I mean, I don't know what else to say except for that the further up the food chain goes, the more concentrated dioxin becomes. And that's why a breastfeeding baby is like basically at the top of the food chain. You know, the more than 90% of our exposure to dioxin is through a food supply, like the fatty part of living things like fish, meat, clams, and their products like butter, eggs, cheese. And so that's where we're getting it. And, you know, I talked to an epidemiologist about this, and, you know, I was like, why are they even allowing us to have any dioxin absorbed into our blood? And he said, quote, like, these are not based on biology or health, it's based on politics. And like I was saying, you know, the EPA and the paper industry and the paper lobbyists were found to be in collusion, and they hid things from the public view. So, and are still hiding things. So to be continued.
All right. I think we are reaching the end of our time.
Yes.
And I thank you very much. It's been good catching up with you and learning about your book. And I think it's been helpful to everybody. We enjoyed it. So
we did. It was great seeing you. I know I've never had like an hour to myself with you. So
right, there's always been 300 other family members.
I know. They're all here too. So
yes, but we can shut them up. We have
that's right. We can mute them finally. No, it was great. Really, thank you for having me. Really. Right. And I put my email in the chat if anybody wants my email, if you have questions, but don't send me your manuscripts to read. I don't have time. But I will just put it in there one more time. There.
Okay.
Hey, Matt.
Right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for coming and hearing about our family reunion. So
Thank you.
Thanks, Mom. Thanks for coming.
Yes. Hi, everybody. All the family members.
Bye.
Okay.
And John.
John.
Wait, is that unmute?
Yeah, we're here.
Hello. Hi.
We had to eat dinner. We had to eat dinner, so we didn't have our visuals up most of the time.
Oh, so nice to see you guys.
Good to see you too.
We should Zoom another room sometime. I would love to.
That would be good.
Congratulations.
Now, Kerri, was John one of your professors at Beloit?
John was my professor at Beloit, yes.
Very briefly.
Yeah,
taught me how to write, taught me how to read. Taught me how to really read, which was the most important part of writing.
Yeah, he's my current editor.
Well, you got some work to do. She's got 700 pages.
Well, it's been written and rewritten and written and rewritten and etc., as you know.
I understand.
When I first was in the paper mill, my father said to me on the first day, because I was walking in a shift when he was coming out, he said to me, okay, you're not just supposed to watch your feet, you're supposed to look overhead. And he said, if you fall into one of these vats, and in my novel, these things are possible. He said, if you fall into one of these vats, you will become National Geographic.
I researched a lot of those things because I was totally, like David, mesmerized by the scariness of them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of terrible videos out there.
Yeah.
Let me tell you.
It was a tough place. I was particularly unhappy with some of my high school classmates who I knew were stoned and driving big machinery. And it wasn't nice because we had to watch all the other mill machinery as well as idiotic guys who would get stoned to go into the mill. And it just infuriated me.
God, how terrible. How terrible. David,
Hi, Maddie.
Okay.
He's muted.
David's gonna cut us off.
Yeah, we have digressed. I
We
think
digress. We will
Later,
have to.
later.
We will have to talk separately.
we'll have a private digression at some point.
But thank you. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, again for coming. Thank you, Kerri. Thank you,
Thanks.
Andrew. And have
Catch
a good,
you on the other
good
side,
evening,
David.
everybody. Okay.
Good night.
Thank you, Lizzie. I forgot to say the Belmont for hosting us
Oh my
today.
God! Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
What?